This is the first session of the histology of the nervous system. A quick overview of the nervous system. The nervous system is classified into the central nervous system that comprises of the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which includes the nerves and their associated ganglia. The nervous system is comprised of cells that are the neurons and the neuroglia. The neurons are the basic structural and functional units of the nervous system. The neurons may be myelinated or unmyelinated, and based on their process, they are either pseudo-unipolar, bipolar, or multipolar, in which case they again might belong to either the Golgi type 1 or the Golgi type 2 neurons. The most abundant cells of the nervous system are the neuroglia, and they vary based on whether they belong to the central nervous system or to the peripheral nervous system. The glial cells of the CNS are the oligodendrocytes, which help in myelination, the astrocytes, which offer metabolic support and are responsible for the blood-brain barrier, the ependymal cells, which line the CSF-filled cavities of the brain and the spinal cord, and the microglial cells. The glial cells of the PNS are the satellite cells and the Schwann cells. On looking at the sections through the nervous system, it can be seen that the substance of the brain or the spinal cord are divided into darker appearing areas, which is called the gray matter, and more pale appearing areas, which is called the white matter. The gray matter is comprised of the nerve cell bodies, the dendrites, and the neuroglial cells, whereas the white matter is predominantly the myelinated axons or nerve fibers and neuroglial cells. In the histology of the central nervous system, we will be looking at the cerebral cortex, the cerebellum, and the spinal cord. This session deals with the histology of the cerebral cortex. Before we proceed, we have a question for you. How does the arrangement of gray and white matter differ in the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the spinal cord? Pause for a moment, think of an answer, and then press proceed. So you might have thought that the cerebrum, as well as the cerebellum, the gray matter is placed outside and the white matter is internal, whereas the spinal cord is the exact opposite of this. The gray matter is in the center, whereas the white matter is placed externally. Histology of the cerebrum. The cells that make up the cerebral cortex, which refers to the gray matter which is placed externally, are the pyramidal cells, the stellate cells, and other cells such as the fusiform Martinotti cells and the cells of Cajal. Most of the layers of the cerebral cortex are made up of pyramidal cells and stellate cells, though in varying proportion depending upon the layer in which they are found. This is a section through the cerebral cortex which demonstrates 6 layers, and thus it belongs to the neocortex. There are other areas which are evolutionary older areas of the cerebrum which might have lesser layers. For example, in the allocortex, which is made up again of the archicortex and the paleocortex. An example is the limbic lobe. So it is important to remember that the cerebral cortex has a variable cytoarchitecture at different parts of the cerebrum. Even within the neocortex, functional areas which differ, namely the sensory area and the motor area, have a slightly variable cytoarchitecture. The motor cortex is also called the agranular cortex, whereas the sensory cortex is also called the granular cortex. The first layer of the cerebral cortex, which underlies the pia mater, is the molecular layer, and it is predominantly made up of nerve fibers of cells such as the cells of Cajal and the neuroglial cells. The second layer, which is internal to the molecular layer, is the external granular layer. This is comprised chiefly of stellate cells and small-sized pyramidal cells. The third layer is the external pyramidal layer, where there are medium-sized pyramidal cells to be found in abundance. Layer number 4 is the internal granular layer. This layer is comprised of densely packed stellate cells. Another chief feature to be noted in layer number 4 is the presence of horizontal fibers which give rise to the external band of Belager, which is especially very prominent in the visual cortex or the striate cortex. Macroscopically, this band of fibers is what gives rise to the stria of Gennari. Layer 5 denotes the internal pyramidal layer, which is also called the ganglionic layer. This layer is very prominent in the motor cortex and consists of the large pyramidal cells of Betz, which give rise to the pyramidal tract or the corticospinal fibers. This layer contains the fibers which comprise the internal band of Belager. Layer 6 is called the polymorphic layer and also has other names such as the fusiform layer or the multiform layer. Cells which are present in this layer are pleomorphic, meaning they have different shapes and sizes. The layer which is internal to the 6th layer is the layer of the white matter. This is a section through the motor cortex. What is demonstrable here are these large bed cells which are seen in layer number 5. The association cortex and the sensory cortex are thinner as compared to the motor cortex. Further, it can be seen that the sensory cortex has a more prominent layer number 4, which is the internal granular layer. That brings us to the summary of the histology of the cerebrum. To be remembered and kept in mind are that the cerebral cortex has a variable cytoarchitecture. The outermost layer is the pia mater, which contains the blood vessels, and the neocortex has 6 layers which comprise the gray matter. The innermost layer is the layer of white matter, which contains the axons or the nerve fibers which are either efferent or efferent to the gray matter.